Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, wherever you may be around the world, and welcome to Splendid Isolation History number 36. And this evening, we're going to be looking at the 100 Days Offensive between August and November in 1918. As always, to get us started, I'm going to start us off with you.
Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness on flooded folk and wall. Your new God's sullen peoples have devil and have child. Take up the white man's burden, in patience to abide, to veil the threat of terror and check the show of pride. By open speech and simple, 100 times made plain, to seek another's profit and work another's gain. Take up the white man's burden, the savage wars of peace. Fill full the mouth of famine and bid the sickness cease. And when your goal is nearest, the end for others sought, what's love that heed and folly? Bring all your hopes to naught. Take up the white man's burden, no tawdry rule of kings, but toil of serf and sweeper, the tale of common things. The ports ye shall not enter, the roads ye shall not tread. Go make them with your living and mark them with your dead. Take up the white man's burden and reap his old reward. The blame of those ye better, the hate of those ye guard. The cry of those ye humor are slowly towards the light. Why brought ye us from bondage, our loved Egyptian night? Take up the white man's burden, ye dare not stoop to less, nor call too loud on freedom to cloak your weariness. By all ye cry or whisper, by all ye leave or do, the silent, sullen people shall wail gods and you. Take up the white man's burden, have done with childish days, the lightly proffered laurel, the easy ungrudged praise. Come thou to search your manhood through all of thankless years. No age with give or wisdom, the judgment of your peers. Take off the white man's burden through all of thankless years. Take up the white man's burden.
I'm sorry. I'm just being incompetent as usual. And that was, of course, the excellent Chris Gard. If you like good music, please go and check out Chris Gard's channel on YouTube. Obviously, we are coming up towards the 11th of November, an Armistice Day. And so my friend here, Mitch, suggested that we do the 100 Days campaign in 1918. as our history stream this week, which I thought was a appropriate idea, and that's what we're going to be doing. So, Mitch, how are you going, mate?
Same old.
All right. Just to give us a little bit of context, obviously in 1917, the Russian Eastern Front of the First World War completely collapsed because of the Bolsheviks and the commies, and they made a peace with Imperial Germany, which was actually a very harsh peace. It was a much harsher peace than the Versailles Treaty, which these days you quite often see people, particularly on the right, criticizing. And, you know, to be fair, if the Versailles Treaty had just been Britain, I don't think it would have been as harsh as it was. The harsh aspects of it were almost entirely driven by the French. There's a surprise. But the Versailles Treaty, considering the number of dead and the devastation all over France and Belgium and Italy and all over Europe, basically, and in other parts of the world, I don't think it was particularly harsh, to be honest with you. But anyway, the Versailles Treaty is an infamous thing, and I see lots of people on the right talking about it these days. The First World War was the most expensive war the British have ever fought. It was far more British and old Commonwealth people died in World War One than died in World War Two. Almost 1 million British and old Commonwealth troops were killed. That's to say British, Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, South African. And also a certain number of native peoples from India and what have you, although far less than people would have you believe today. Yeah, it was a very expensive war. Britain, as far as I'm concerned, Britain's original sin was joining World War I in 1914. And then to make it far, far worse, we raised a mass army against all British military tradition. I mean, Britain had always had a huge navy, and that's how we fight our wars traditionally. But in the First World War, we decided we were also going to raise an enormous army. As a result of that, because we spent 4 years fighting the main body of the enemy, which is to say the German army, which was an extremely good army, you have to be fair, British casualties were enormous. And as I say, almost 1 million British and old Commonwealth war dead, and they were mostly white guys in the British Empire, just to be clear. Yes, there were certain Indians and what have you who fought on the Western Front for a brief period of time, but only for a brief period of time because they couldn't cope with the winters there. And they were fairly quickly sent off to places like East Africa, where they were fighting von Lettow-Vorbeck, and places like Palestine, and also what would become Iraq, so which was part of the Turkish Empire back then, and so relatively small numbers of Indian soldiers actually fought on the Western Front. And when they did, they didn't do so for all that long. Everybody, of course, knows that the original Little British Army in 1914 was the old Contemptible, supposedly, an army that was so small that the Kaiser said if the British invaded, I'll send a policeman to arrest it. But they were old, long service professional soldiers and were probably the best soldiers in the world in 1914. Certainly the most accurate and fastest firing shots with a rifle. But they were very quickly, within a year or so, the vast majority of that beautiful little army was destroyed in the mincing machine of the German artillery. The Germans had far more guns than Britain did. Although it's worth pointing out in 2025 that the tiny British army in 1914 was almost 3 times the size of the British army in 2025. I mean, only today on X, on Twitter, I was seeing that Britain is down to 89 105mm guns. We have less artillery than Estonia, and our stupid socialist government still wants to try and gain arguments with very powerful nations like Russia, which strikes me as insanity, basically. But yeah, to take care, of course. I mean, it would never surprise me if in future years he turns out to be an agent of communist China or something, because he certainly isn't doing anything for the real British people. So anyway, yeah, that was the 1914 army. There was an enormous swell of enthusiasm in Britain in 1914, and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people even volunteered and joined the army. So for quite a long time, Britain only brought conscription in 1917, I think. Until then, they didn't need to because they had enough volunteers. And that was the first time also that Britain had ever brought in conscription for the army, by the way. But that wasn't until 1917. I think most people broadly know the story of the first day of the Somme, which was the single bloodiest day in British Army history. 60,000 British soldiers, and they were almost all actually British soldiers. I think there was one regiment of Newfoundlanders who took part, because in those days it wasn't yet part of Canada, so the Newfoundland military was separate from that, and they took part on the first day of the Somme and also got slaughtered like the British did. But most of the troops were actually British troops, and it was the single bloodiest day in British military history. 60,000 men, which is to say the vast majority of the total size of the British Army today. It would leave a remnant if we lost 60,000 men today. 60,000 men were killed or wounded or missing on one day, and 20,000 of them, roughly speaking, were killed outright in one day. It was a complete disaster. The battle went on for months. Yes, we killed quite a lot of Germans, but the Germans killed quite a lot of us, and the only quite small amounts of land were captured. And of course, because Germany invaded France at the beginning of the war, the First World War was all fought on Belgian and French territory in the Western Front. So the Germans were fighting on enemy territory, which in some ways is a huge advantage, of course, because the devastation you're wreaking all over the place, you're not doing on your own land, you're doing on someone else's. Then, of course, we have 1917. And in 1917, the French army, which had even higher casualties than the British, had very wide-scale mutinies. You know, the French army became a very fragile instrument after 1917. The French soldiers, who, as I say, had lost even more men than the Brits because they had a bigger army, there were large-scale French mutinies. Quite a lot of French soldiers ended up being shot. Not as many as were condemned, but still quite a lot of them were shot. And yeah, you had to be very careful how you used the French army after that. Now, to take pressure off the French, of course, the French had fought at Verdun, which was another enormous killing field of the First World War. And to take pressure off the French, Haig and the British army, Haig was the British commander-in-chief, they launched an attack, which is actually officially the third Battle of Ypres, but it's generally better known as Passchendaele. which is very low-lying terrain. There was a lot of rain that year. The whole battlefield turned into a gigantic mud pit. You could drown in the shell holes if you fell into them. And the tanks were useless there because it was too muddy. They just bogged down. And it was a wild battle. One of my own great grandfathers lost a leg at Passchendaele. He had a tin leg. But my dad, when he was a little boy before World War II, would put marbles in his tin leg so he made a noise when he walked. And my grandfather, because he was an asshole boy, just used to think it was funny. But anyway, yeah, he lost his leg there. So this was a disastrous battle, enormous casualties. As a result of this, Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, kept Haig very short of troops after this, so he couldn't launch another offensive. But of course, as I just said before, the Russian front collapsed as a result of Lenin and the commies coming into power and the Bolsheviks. And that meant the Germans had loads and loads of divisions that were freed up who'd been fighting on the Eastern Front, who they could transfer to the Western Front. And by this time, the German unrestricted submarine warfare had annoyed the Americans enough that they decided they were going to join the war on the Allied side. Although they weren't going to be an Allied power, they were going to be an associated power, as if that made a difference. But anyway, so the Germans knew the Americans were going to be ending up sending troops over. But the American army was even tinier than the British army before the war. And other than their US Marine Corps division and their 1st Infantry Division, who were made up of their pre-war regulars, the American army was going to take quite a long time before it could get a lot of troops into Europe, and particularly before they would actually get into battle. Haig, the British commander, is short of troops. The French have mutinied on a very large scale and are a very delicate instrument at the moment, certainly in terms of attacking. You couldn't really attack much with the French army after 1917 for a while. And the Germans are transferring hundreds of thousands of troops from the Eastern Front to the Western Front. And you then get the famous Kaiserbau, the Kaiserschlacht, which was Germany's last attempt to try and win the war, using stormtrooper tactics and what have you. And basically what stormtroopers did, they carried lighter machine guns, submachine guns. They had early Bergmann submachine guns, obviously grenades, flamethrowers. The Germans would use loads of gas shells as well as high explosive. And basically what the stormtroopers did was they outflanked and went around defensive positions and left the less good German infantry coming up behind them to mop those guys up. And by doing this, they were able to take quite a lot of land, particularly because the British army, mostly because of the Lloyd George British government, was really short troops. The Germans made a lot of territory during the Kaiserbau, and there were various phases of it. It was relaunched on a number of occasions. But they took quite a lot of territory, but they were not able to break the British army. And the first bit of the Kaiserbau was all aimed at the British army. And the British, with their Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, and South African comrades, were able to basically stop the Germans eventually. One of the things that stopped the Germans was that when they overran British supply bases, the Germans were amazed at how many supplies the British troops had compared to them. Because, of course, the British blockade by this stage was cutting into even the German military, and the German military were much better fed than the German civilians were.
Yeah, Ernst Jäger. I was going to say Ernst Junger talks about in his book, Storm Steel. He talks about how where the Germans were feasting on turnip soup for months, and then they come across like bacon and tin stew, among other things, in our camps. Which you imagine as a German, soldier, you're looking at the absolute feast that slows down the German advance, alongside other things like, for example, the Somme area, which we attacked back in 1916. That area got ruined. It took ages to repair all the damaged land and whatnot.
Yeah, one of the things in the First World War, Mitch, was that if you attacked, the best way of attacking was with artillery in those days. It was artillery that killed most soldiers in the First World War, by the way. People will tell you it's machine guns. No, it wasn't. It was artillery. And of course, when you bombard an enemy position with artillery, you break up all the ground. And so getting your supplies forward afterwards is quite difficult. And that happened on a massive scale during the Kaiser battles. And slowed the Germans down again. Now, one thing the Kaiser battles did do is they forced the setting up of an Allied commander-in-chief, who was the French General Foch. And he had broad overall control over all the armies, so over the French army, obviously, but also over the British army and even the very small Belgian army. And I think there were even some Portuguese and what have you knocking around on the Western Front for a while. So they had a commander-in-chief now, and that helped because he was able to direct forces to where he wanted them, although Haig and the British Army retained quite a lot of independence. Foch's orders to Haig were generally couched in the form of requests, but Haig would generally do them because Haig wasn't a total idiot. Anyway, after this, of course, Lloyd George had to release a lot of reinforcements to Haig from Britain, who he had been deliberately holding back. So the British Army, after the Kaiser battle, so this is up to about, July, end of July, beginning of August 1918. The British Army got quite a lot of reinforcements from Europe, and it also got quite a lot of extra troops who they were able to send there by cutting down the number of soldiers we had in Italy. Britain had quite a lot of soldiers in Italy to stop the Italians collapsing, alongside the French. And we also were able to send some troops from Palestine and places like that to Europe as well, because by this time that campaign had been quite successful, and we defeated the Turks, captured most of Palestine for the little that was worth. And at this stage, a lot of people were considering the war was going to finish in 1919. In fact, there was a famous plan, 1919, etc. But some people, including Haig, thought that there was a chance of actually ending the war in 1918. And it's at this stage that we can start to talk about 1918 and the 100 Days campaign. And I am pretty much totally going to hand this over to Mitch now. So, Mitch, go for it, man.
Just to tell, for example, this line here, that was where the Germans were at the start of the spring offensive or the Kaiserschlacht. And this was all the land that they took. So, like Peronne, once DDA, they were like 10 miles away from Amiens, which Amiens was quite interesting, and also very valuable because it was a communications and railway hub that connected us and the French. If the Germans were to take that, Ludendorff would achieve his objective of splitting us apart, and it would make the American intervention quite complicated. Because it's worth noting that while the Germans didn't really have a high opinion of the Americans in terms of their combat ability, it was more the fact that the Americans were a fresh pair. They could bring in like 250. They could bring in like 250,000 men a month. The Germans knew for a while they were against the clock. So Ludendorff launches this offensive. and using the tactics learned from Georg Bruckmüller, the artillery guy, as well as Oscar von Hutier, who pioneers these stormtrooper tactics. Although it's worth noting, the stormtrooper tactics, people think the Germans were the first ones to create it. No, it's actually Bruce Love in his famous 1916 offensive that pioneered it. But the Germans took a lot of notes off that, and they get to it even better than the Russians did. But the thing was, heavy casualties, and all this land just becomes a white elephant. You see like a salient, so just awkward land to try and also when we eventually do launch the 100 Days Offensive, starting around here, east of Amiens, the land just goes quick because it's not well fortified. Ludendorff, essentially, he's brought in like a strategic white elephant with this land, and he refuses to pull back his troops. According to, like, for example, you have the Hindenburg line, which would be around here. For example, Cambrai was one anchor of the Hindenburg line, but Ludendorff, he just refused to countenance the idea of having to pull back. So, for example, in early July, the German foreign minister, who just got the sack by Richard von Kuhl, who negotiated the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, he was saying, even after all this land was taken, he said, look, there is no conceivable way that we, the Germans, can actually win this war militarily. There is no way that we can actually win. That was his last speech in the Reichstag in early July 1918. Fast forward to early August, because it's worth noting, just after the spring offensive was launched, we have, of course, Ferdinand Foch. Ferdinand Foch, he is a lot, I wouldn't say he's massively aggressive, but certainly he is far more of the attack notion than Philippe Pétain, because it's worth noting, Ferdinand Foch, he's Supreme Allied Commander. Haig is in charge of the British Army. Philippe Pétain is in charge of the French Army. And then you have John J. Pershing in charge of the Americans. It was going to be us spearheading the 100 Days Offensive, especially the Canadians and the Australians. So one thing that was a real nuisance to plan was, so you have the Canadians. They were going to be pushing first along this sector, but we knew that if the Germans would be keeping a weather eye on where the Canadians were, so we faked it so that the Canadians looked like they're around here in Flanders. So the Germans, they reroute some of their men up north. We then attack August 6th and achieve complete surprise. The counter battery fire from the Canadians under Andrew McNaughton do their job brilliantly, because it's worth noting that, for example, a quarter of all German guns were at the front lines to ward off tanks, but that also meant that our aerial reconnaissance were very good at picking them up. So, yeah, by all rights, it was just a matter of when the 100 Days Offensive commences, everything just goes right for us. You know, the Canadians, especially under Sir Arthur Currie, I mean, you could not fault them at all. They pioneered the tactics. So it's
probably worth pointing out, Mitch, that by 1918, and this was obviously true of the Canadian Corps, the Australian Corps, the New Zealand Division, as well as the British troops. By 1918, these guys fighting on the Western Front had pretty much become very professional soldiers. They've been fighting, some of them, for 3 years at this stage. In the British case, sometimes 4 years, if they survived. And the army had got pretty good. And in particular, the British and Commonwealth artillery was very good by this stage, which it wasn't early in the war. The infantry really knew their business. There were a lot more machine guns in infantry companies than there had been at the beginning of the war. You know, Britain went to war in 1914 with two machine guns per infantry battalion. By the end of the war, a platoon would have 2 and occasionally 3 Lewis guns, which was a light machine gun. And we had whole companies and battalions of people armed with Vickers heavy machine guns. A lot had changed, but the British and Commonwealth troops had become pretty good. And as Mitch was alluding to there, I think the Canadians and the Australians and New Zealanders, etc., had a very high reputation, including amongst the Germans. And so if you put one of those, one of their divisions somewhere, the Germans would suspect you were going to do an attack. So, yeah, sorry, Mitch, you carry on, mate.
Yeah, so to understand like how the Canadians especially came to be so successful, first you have to understand like the German defensive tactics were elastic defense. So you have like your forward outpost, which would essentially be like these would be like your third-rate infantry machine gun posts. They would do their best to gun down as many of the charging, that's the Canadians or British or French, whomever. And once they've done their job, they then pull back towards the main line. These will be your more storm troops, and these will be your better troops. They would then counterattack, just as the enemy not only get bombarded by artillery, but also it's a matter of heavy casualties have already been sustained by the defending force. Because the thing was, in earlier offensives, for example, at the Battle of the Somme, we would often not just take the first trench, we'd try and get the whole thing. We didn't know when to stop while we were still ahead. And Douglas Haig was known for doing that, where he gets confident and he doesn't know when to quit while he was still far ahead. And by this time, the Canadians under Sir Arthur Currie, they started to pioneer what they call bite and hold. So the Canadians, first thing they would do is they take over this forward outpost. They'll do so with such surprise and such vigor that, I think in one attack, I can't remember which one it was precisely, but they only take like 20 casualties in one attack in daylight. And those 20 casualties were only a thing because of like unexploded artillery shells from our own side. That was how damn good the Canadians were in achieving not just complete surprise, but also just complete aggression in the face of German defensive depth system. So one thing Sir Arthur Currie does is he has his artillery so that they start peppering against the main line of German soldiers as they leave their trenches to counterattack the Canadians, who may think have suffered casualties when they haven't. And it's just a matter of they've turned the defensive depth system completely on his arse against the Germans. So by this time, it's worth knowing as well that the German soldiers, they're not the same as what they were back in 1915. A lot of them are worn down. A lot of them are despondent. They know after the spring offensive, they know full well, okay, they're not going to win the war. So when they're dealing with a highly aggressive offensive from most of the Canadians, as well as the Australians, their despondency, a lot of it takes root. So you often have, for example, first day, the 8th of August, the Black Day of the German Army, as Ludendorff called it. It was something like 50,000 German casualties, of whom 33,000 were taken captive. And this was done often where the German soldiers would just surrender in large groups, well armed, with plenty of ammunition, but they just don't want to bother fighting anymore. They were just thinking, well, we'll get better food and better medical treatment from the British Empire at this point than we would from our own.
It's Mitch. It's just to emphasise what you were saying. What Ludendorff called the Black Day of the German Army. The British and old Commonwealth soldiers took 17,000 German prisoners on one day. They captured 339 German guns, and the Germans lost about 30,000 men killed and wounded, whereas our casualties were 6,500. So the Germans lost 5 times as many casualties as we did. And we were attacking, which in the First World War, of course, was unheard of, because, the defense had such a huge advantage for most of the First World War.
Yeah, and just to get a so, for example, you take, for example, this was like the defensive line on day one, at Amiens. By the end, so the offensive started around 4:30 in the morning. By the time you hit 11 a.m., the Canadians have achieved all their objectives far ahead of schedule. Douglas Haig, for example, he was expecting the offensive to take like a few more days, but the Canadians achieved all their objectives within the first 7 hours. That was how damn good they were. And you can see, for example, so the Canadians are charging down the centre. On the right flank, you have the French on their objectives Montdidier around here, while the Australians there to advance on the left flank around Albert and the Somme River. The Australians, meanwhile, they were known. They were under Sir John Monash, who was probably one of the finest commanders alongside Sir Arthur Currie of the entire First World War for our side. The Australians also were feared by the Germans and respected because they were damn good at raiding the German trenches, plus also adeptly using armor. So it was just a matter of when you have the Canadians in the center, the Australians down the left, and then you got the French in support on the right. You get a small, you can get a small microcosm of as to why the Germans end up buckling. Everything just went right to play.
Mitch, I saw people in the chat talking about the Canadians not taking many prisoners. It has to be said that neither the Canadians nor the Australians were particularly well known for taking loads and loads of prisoners. They didn't. If you didn't surrender straight away, you were probably going to get killed. Like I remember reading some stuff about the Australians on the Western Front quite a few years ago now. And when they were attacking German pillboxes, and a pillbox was basically a concrete fortification in which you would put machine guns. And the Australians adopted the opinion that if they attacked a pillbox and it killed some of their mates and it didn't surrender straight away, when the Germans did surrender, they just killed them.
Yeah,
and I can't say I blame them. It's always been a delicate matter about when you surrender, you know.
Yeah, because that becomes a common thing where you have because this is one thing that's often mentioned in that they shall not grow old or they shall never grow old. He was obviously the German soldiers were very stubborn. Now, granted, a lot of German units would fight stubbornly, but I said the main mood among the German soldiers would have despondency. So plenty would just surrender straight away, especially when dealing with the Canadians with surprise and vigor, and dealing with the Australians as well. And you just have like a prison. I mean, that was the attitude.
There's a standard thing, Mitch, that if you try and surrender and you leave it too late, the enemy will go too late, chum, and just kill you. And that applied to British troops as well as Australians and Canadians, and I'm sure it applied to the Germans when they were attacking. If you didn't surrender early enough and you killed enough of the guys' mates, they were not going to let you surrender. They were just going to fucking murder you, basically. Yeah. And that was true of all armies.
To echo Ayosha, the Bavarians and Prussians would often, when they were on the retreat, there'd be situations while they were plundering northern France and parts of Belgium on their retreat. There was one scenario where 15 German soldiers were killed in this massive brawl, including one officer who tried to break it all up. He was chucked from the third floor of a building and he had his neck broken. That was how that was pretty much what a lot of the German soldiers were doing at this point. They would just give a heck of a dodge. They would either surrender, a lot of them. Some would be stubborn, quite a few of them would still believe that they could somehow win. A lot of them would just cope in by going, oh, well, they think the Americans will change sides. Because if one knows anything about Frederick the Great, it's that he was saved by the Russian Tsarina dying literally at the last moment, just as Berlin could have been taken. And that sort of mythology of the miracle of the House of Brandenburg, that basically becomes a common feature every time a German are in a sticky situation like 100 Days Offensive, where they're trying to think, well, this isn't going to last. It wants to be something like the Americans and the Brits will fall out, or the French will come to peace before the British do. Like, there'll be someone doing a separate peace or something. But by this point, everyone's like, one thing about our success was we, Pétain, Pershing, and Foch were all on the same page. Granted, for example, if you, it's not immediately stable, but yeah. So this was launched on August 8th. By the time you get to August 11th, the offensive in this sector peters out, because by this time the artillery guns that covers Curry's advance, especially Curry's forces, now out of range, and in accordance with the bite and hold tactics that Curry pointed, you don't go beyond the range of your artillery that will cover your advance. In fact, the Canadians often have this idea of leaning into the barrage, so that once the barrage has ended, your troops are on top of the enemy before they've even got a position to react. So much so that it's like the first 15 minutes of the offensive in Amiens sector, the trenches were overrun, the Canadians and Australians were leapfrogging each other, and the German High Command, it took them far longer than they thought it should have done for them to be notified that these areas had fallen, because German telephone lines were cut, or they were overrun before these German troops on the front lines could phone up High Command.
Very true, Mitch. And of course, when you say leaning into the barrage, all experienced troops on the Western Front would stay as close to the barrage as you could, because even though you would take certain casualties from bits of shrapnel and shell caps and what have you coming back at you from your own guns, you took far less casualties that way than if the enemy could open fire on you, which they couldn't if you stayed close enough to the barrage, because they were busy taking cover, of course. Yeah, and as I say, it's worth emphasizing. Everyone who sees something on the First World War thinks about machine guns and all the rest of it. The real killer in the First World War, and in fact the real killer in every big war, is artillery. It's not small arms, it's artillery.
Yeah, and one thing about this, just because the offensive petered out in the Amiens sector doesn't mean it petered out anywhere else, because at this time, Foch, Haig, and Pétain, as well as Pershing, they all came to the conclusion that even if one sector peters out, you must attack in another sector. So, in short, you never give a German army any sense of rest, because at this point, the main fear among especially in Ferdinand Foch's mind and Douglas Haig's, was that the Germans would try and withdraw to either the Hindenburg line, which is, for example, in the Cambrai area, or even worse, they could do a line stretching from Antwerp here all the way to the Meuse River. It'd be much shorter, and the Germans could have they could give their troops a lot more respite in terms of their reserves, for example, being able to bridge gaps more. Because at this point,
and Mitch, the Hindenburg line, just to let people know, was a really well fortified and prepared German position. Like, it had concrete trenches and bunkers and pillboxes and all the rest of it. It wasn't like your typical muddy British trench in World War One. It was a very well fortified and position, which the Germans had built up over months before they occupied it. And then, of course, they advanced in front of it due to the Kaiserbaus. And eventually they withdrew back into it, not to spoil what Mitch is talking about at the moment, but yeah.
Yeah, so you have, as I said, like this is like the main fear among the Allied generals, is that the Germans could fall back and shorten their lines. In so doing, we just go back to a slog. But, of course, Ludendorff, at this point, if Ludendorff was around today, he would be diagnosed as being manically depressive around this time, because he's jumping between one minute being massively optimistic, thinking, well, if he just gets a few more guys drafted into the army, he could plug all these gaps. He could hold on to the land that he originally taken in the Kaiserschlacht. But there are other guys on the ground. For example, one army group chief of staff by the name of Fritz von Lossberg, he's been telling Ludendorff for months, look, all this land we've taken around, for example, this sector, we can't defend it in the event of an Allied offensive, like what we ended up doing in early to mid-August. So, but Ludendorff, he just ignores them. He just doesn't want to listen to it. Like he does a cardinal sin, which he himself replaced. He and Hindenburg in 1916 replaced Erich von Falkenhayn because they blamed Falkenhayn of sunk cost fallacy, that he was sinking too much German blood into the Battle of Verdun and not willing to listen to people below. Well, but Hindenburg at this point, he's a lot more sort of inactive. He's a lot more lethargic. He doesn't, he lets Ludendorff do all the decision making. But Ludendorff at this point, he himself is just doing the same thing as what he accused his predecessor of making, just sunk cost fallacy, refusing to listen to his subordinates, and he was also sidelining some army group commanders, such as Crown Prince Ruprecht, son of Kaiser Wilhelm, and just sidelining.
Who was actually quite a good German commander, by the way. Even though the Kaiser wasn't the brightest tool in the shed, Ruprecht was quite good, actually. I would just like to address Key Buckley, who's saying that in the wider historical aspect, the fighting was academic, which is disgusting to hear, considering the number of casualties, but the Germans were beaten diplomatically, not militarily. One of the points of this stream, Key Buckley, is to point out that actually the Germans were fairly substantially beaten militarily at the end of the war.
Yeah, just to look at this map, right? So this is what this line here is what the Germans were at in early August. So let's say August 1st, for argument's sake. This line here is where the Germans were on the day of the armistice. That's how much land, they lost all the. So this Belgian coastline, for example, we wanted that because German U-boats were using this as a staging point. The Belgians up in the north, alongside Herbert Plumer's troops, they were eager to liberate as much Belgium as possible. The French were wanted all this land back because this is some of our best farming and industrial land, which is one reason why in this time, because often people think about America as being an industrial power, especially in the Second World War. Well, in this war, we were the main industrial power because France was ruined by all this land being occupied here in the north. The Americans, meanwhile, their troops were having to be supplied more by us and the French. They had to, you have American troops in one sector who would have, let's say, Brodie helmets and Lewis guns, and that perhaps Lee Enfield rifles. I mean, another sector would have French army equipment with Adrian helmet, the Shorshot machine gun, which was not as good as ours. And a lot of American soldiers complained about that particular machine gun. But yeah, it was.
Yeah, and the irony, Mitch, is that the British Army's light machine gun, which was a better machine gun, as you say, than the French Shoshat, the British Army machine gun, the Lewis gun, was actually an American design, but built in Britain.
Yeah, and it was because of a personal drama between the Lewis gun's inventor versus a guy who was in charge of the American army in the early 1910s, basically. So, their loss, our gain. But anyway, and after the initial battle, so you have this. So this is where, in late August, after having stormed through the Amiens sector, this is where. So you factor, for example. Where is it? I'm just.
While you're finding that, Mitch, let me just address a comment in chat. Air Shatori, good friend of the channel, who's often on the stream. He's saying that there were left-wing uprisings, including Hamburg, with the German sailors. And I just say to you, AI, that we will actually address the German High Seas Fleet and the sailors' mutiny, but we'll do that at the end of the stream.
Yeah, so I just got confused. I basically got confused. So, at the end of August, we then staged another offensive, but this time in the Ala operational theatre. You see here, there's a section of a Hindenburg line and also there's an old British line because these were positions we held early on in the year. The Canadians, they are the vanguard, and you also have the 1st and 3rd armies around the 17th Corps to the right flank. Yeah, the Canadians just they get to the rear of the Hindenburg line. This is one area where they really get into breaking the Hindenburg line, and especially around here, the Drocourt-Quéant line, which was broken on the 1st of September. Around that time, Douglas Haig was again phoned in by Sir Henry Wilson, the chief of the Imperial War Staff, I believe his title was. He was
chief of the Imperial General Staff.
Yeah, he was getting telephone because David Lloyd George. He was saying to Douglas Haig, "Look, we are telling you, don't get heavy casualties about all this." Essentially, it was just a civilian government trying to just giving Haig a load of lip that he really could deal with.
And to be fair, Mitch, and I'm not Haig's greatest defender by any means, but I think some of the things that Haig faced in World War One were things that all generals in World War One faced. It was just the defense had an enormous advantage over the offense. But one of the things you have to say about Haig in 1918 is he doesn't persist with single attacks. What he does is he'll do an attack, his troops will break through, and then as soon as that offensive starts to slow down, he'll attack somewhere else.
Yeah, and even because if you watch Indy Nidell on the Great War Channel from nearly you're talking about 7 years back now, he'll just say Douglas Haig at this point was probably one of the best commanding. He was a field marshal by this point, wasn't he? So yeah, he was certainly one of probably but he was certainly one of the best guys commanding at this time. And so the Drocourt-Quéant line, now this was seen as not impregnable. The Canadians having broken it, however, by the time you reach September 1st, and this is where the offensive peters out on September the 2nd. Started August 22nd. 26th. Sorry. This is where they start, and by the time you get to September 4th, this is where they are. But yeah, this Drocourt-Quéant line. So much so
I think, Mitch, I think to be fair, even British and Commonwealth commanders said that if they'd have been attacking the German army in 1916, they wouldn't have been able to break the Hindenburg line. It was just the standard of the German troops. By 1918, they just weren't up to the same standard. Bear in mind, the Germans had enormous casualties, just like the British and French.
Yeah, it's like I reckon I can't confirm it for sure, but I remember reading somewhere that the Germans suffered, for example, 1 million casualties in the spring offensives. So, the Germans, I mean, as much as people, because as to echo Aaron Hook in the chat, because there's a lot of I blame Blackadder for this, where they go lions led by donkeys, and that's a pervasive myth that it's quite annoying. But you have the Germans; they were themselves doing their own strategic mistakes in terms of horrible use of manpower and so on. But this particular line, when this is taken, Haig personally messages the Canadians under Archibald MacDonald, I believe the guy's name was, commanding the 1st Canadian Division, just saying, look, this is bloody magnificent. This is magnificent. This especially helps Haig when he's having to deal with a lot of stress from the civilian government, from David Lloyd George and Sir Henry Wilson. So you can understand why Haig was very popular amongst the Canadians, for example, especially around this time in early September. And
Haig gets a bad press sometimes. I mean, I think Aaron's right about this in the chat. Sometimes Haig gets an overly bad press. He was fighting a war where a combination of quick-firing, long-range artillery, machine guns, magazine rifles, barbed wire, air reconnaissance, etc., just made it very, very difficult to attack successfully.
Yeah, I would say like there was what's the name of a podcast I was watching? Basically he was talking about Spencer Jones, I believe, and Dan Hill within the terms like one guy being an academic. They were saying basically, so 1918, all the lessons come together. That's purely it. Basically, like you have a battle of Cambrai the year before in 1917 where you see a mass use of tanks, but that flopped because we had to learn some lessons about the use of tanks because.
Well, not only that, Mitch, with Cambrai, which of course is a very famous battle these days, but with Cambrai, there were not enough British reserves to actually keep pushing the offensive. And of course, even though they used massed tanks for the first time, I mean, tanks were first used in battle by the British, who invented them in 1916, but they were used in very small numbers on the Somme, etc. Because they didn't have very large numbers of them. At Cambrai, for the first time, they used hundreds of tanks. And initially, they were very successful. But the trouble with World War I tanks is they broke down a lot. And they were quite vulnerable to shell fire, etc. They were proof against ordinary rifle or machine gun bullets. But the Germans had introduced a tungsten cored anti-tank round for their ordinary rifles, and also they produced a gigantic anti-tank rifle that would also go through them. And then, of course, the Germans started using field guns. I mean, as Mitch said earlier in this stream, about a quarter of the German guns, or certainly 25, probably about a quarter, 20-25% of the German artillery had to be used closer to the front lines as anti-tank artillery. And that, of course, weakened the German artillery for use in other places. Matilda was a World War II tank, Watkins plus in the chat. But yeah, it was an infantry tank, but it was a World War II tank, totally different thing. The World War I tanks were quite thinly armored, really, and they weren't that reliable. They could the Mark 1, 2, 3, 4 tanks, which were the main big rhomboidal ones that people think of when you think of tanks, and there's a picture of one in the thumbnail for the stream. Those tanks could only do about 3 or 4 miles an hour, so they could go about as fast as you can walk, basically.
Yeah. That's another thing was one other thing was so there were cases along in this offensive where essentially you have German guys who were working with anti-tank artillery sort of things. They were just taken captive without ever having fired a single shot. Why? Because the aerial recon planes flying overhead meant just terrified those guys because they knew full well that if they were to fire off a shell, that was it. They'd be taken out. Where was the Canadians, especially Andrew McNaughton, the counter battery guy for the Canadians, he would do like his MO like was if these anti-tank guns fire, take him out. If they don't, take him captive.
Just to answer Woodpit in the chat, the French had about 3 different types of tanks. The Renault was one of them. That's the little small tank with a little turret that had either a machine gun or a 37mm gun in it. The Americans also used. But they had 2 other tanks which were not as good as the British ones, it has to be said. They had much shorter track bases. The British had also developed a thing called the Whippet, which was a lighter tank, and that was quite a bit faster. That tank was quite a bit faster. So the British also had more than one sort of tank. But you had to have a lot of them, and they broke down a lot. So, they weren't quite a war-winning weapon in 1918, but they could certainly help you break through a trench system and knock out enemy machine gun posts and all that sort of thing. The Germans also developed a tank. And there's only one original still left, and it's in Australia because the Australians captured it. And it's called Mephistopheles. That was what the Germans called it. And the Germans captured that. And I've seen that. It used to be in the Queensland Museum in Brisbane. I'm not sure if it's not in the Canberra museum now. It might be. They might have loaned it to them. But it's the only original First World War German tank in the world. The Germans didn't build that many of them. They were huge things. They were huge things. Yeah, they were huge, Mitch, and they had crews of like 15 blokes. But they weren't particularly good. But the Germans did also use some captured British and French tanks as well.
Yeah, because in 100 days we were using, it was Mark V tank, and apparently there were there was a male and a female version. The male had 2 6-pounders, while the female had a couple of, I can't remember if it was Lewis guns or Vickers guns, but yeah, the female tanks were
Vickers machine guns that they used, I believe.
Yeah, because I know the Sopwith Camel fighter plane, which we'll be using.
They even had one, Mitch. They had another tank called a hermaphrodite, which had one side with 6-pounders and one side with Vickers guns.
Yeah. Oh, that was the one thing I forgot to mention. There was the Air Force side of things. You got to factor the German Air Force at this time. They were not as good as what they were under Manfred von Richthofen. But the aerial recon capabilities of the German army were much screwed over as well by our.
Yeah, and to be fair, Mitch, to be fair, part of the reason for that was that the British had introduced 3 new fighter aircraft. The British introduced the Sopwith Camel, which is very famous, of course. They also introduced the SE-5A, which was another very good British single-engine fighter in World War I, and also the Bristol fighter, which was a 2-seat fighter. And those 3 aircraft had actually managed to wrest aerial superiority away from the Germans. So this is another reason why the German Air Force was not so good. Of course, Richthofen himself had been killed, either by the Canadians or the Australians, depending on who you believe, and it could be either because, confusion. And his squadron had been taken over by Hermann Goering, who, of course, later became quite famous as head of the Luftwaffe. And in World War I, Hermann Goering was actually a good and brave fighter pilot, but he wasn't Richthofen.
Yeah, and that's the thing about the 100 Days Offensive is that it was just a perfect synergy of combined arms warfare for us. Like the Air Force were, they were called the RAF by this point, I believe, because it was originally called the RFC, Royal Flying Corps, but they changed its name to RAF, I believe, in 1918 by this point. You have...
big mistake. They should have kept the Royal Flying Corps under the Army and the Royal Naval Air Service under the Royal Navy. That would have been much more sensible. Creating the RAF was a mistake. Controversial opinion, but there we go.
Yeah.
I also just say, Mitch, before we go on, can I just say to people, please hit the thumbs up button, the like button. It really does help the stream. Takes you a second. Doesn't cost you a penny. And also, if you want to support the channel, you can do so, and you can also ask super chat questions, which we will answer towards the end of the stream via Entropy, and that is the URL for that is pinned at the top of the chat.
Yeah, I'll just conclude on this map by going, so remember this place, Baral, because this is where this offensive in this particular sector peters out by September 4th. And this is the Canal du Nord and the area and this Cambrai offensive, which is a continuation of what went on in the previous map. This starts on September the 27th and it ends pretty much on October 11th. By the end of all this, the Hindenburg line is broken. Like what chance the Germans had of trying to keep us in place and try to, because I think as I said, with the Black Day of the German army, Ludendorff said words to the effect of, "We cannot win this war, but we must not lose it." That was the opinion and the conviction of the German military at this point, which was they were trying hard to attrite the Allied armies to a point where there'd be some sort of compromise peace. But with this particular offensive where the Hindenburg line is decisively broken, nope. there's no chance of that now. Like, it's completely arse over tip. Especially when, for example, October 1st, you have October 1st when they have taken Cambrai. Yeah, that's at the point where Ludendorff goes cap in hand to the Kaiser, saying, "We need to make peace with the West now. Like, we can't. We've lost the war. There is no military victory to be had here, and we've lost diplomatically. Therefore, from this point onward." Yeah, and I'll stop. So you have a Canal du Nord. No, you'll notice the arrows start here because there was only one bridge along this entire canal that wasn't blown up by the Germans in retreat. It was around 2,500 yards wide, and the Canadian Corps had to charge across it in the midst of daylight. It was a very risky operation for the Canadians to do it this way. Even Haig was just telephoning Sir Arthur Currie, going, "Are you serious to actually want to do this? Because it will require a lot of guts on the part of the Canadians to do it this way." And certainly, like, for example, we have one division that branches off towards the area of Cambrai through the Boulogne Wood, which had to be cleared. Meanwhile, the rest of the Canadian Corps, they circle around and wipe out. Because one thing about the Canal du Nord, I believe it had steep banks, so that's why you could not cross it except with the use of this one bridge left standing. And the offensive you have one arrow leading towards Cambrai from the bridge. Meanwhile, the offensive peters out into other areas. So, for example, from September 27th here to October the 1st, already Cambrai is largely fallen, as well as you're halfway through the small village of Bantigny. And then by the time you get to October 11th, the offensive peters out along the Canal de la Sensée, if I'm pronouncing that right, and taking these villages around here like Ramillies, Escaut, Dreuve. I can't pronounce French for a lot from me, man. And yeah, and you got fact. So if you take this
scale, look at me for French pronunciations, Mitch.
Yeah, yeah. French is one of the languages I struggle with, which is quite funny. But yeah, so absolute massive amount of land, comparatively speaking, in terms of World War One, taken in the space of around 2 weeks, give or take, including, of course, Cambrai, which was a prize, because Cambrai, of course, is one of the linchpins of the Hindenburg line. After this, yeah, things have gone really pear-shaped with the Germans. There's no way there's no military. Unequivocally, it was a military defeat. It's not just a diplomatic defeat for them. It was in military terms. It was disaster at this point. There was nothing stopping it. After this point, the likes of Ferdinand Foch were considering marching right up to the River Rhine, because there was nothing after the Hindenburg. There was, in late September, there was talk about what was called the Hermann Line, but we brought through the Hindenburg line before we even started construction of these lines to the rear of the Hindenburg.
The Germans thought they could hold the Hindenburg line because it was the most formidable defensive position on the Western Front, and unfortunately for them, they weren't able to. Watkins Plus in the chat saying breastplates would have been advisable in World War One. Ned Kelly was a prophet. Watkins Plus, they did use body armor in World War One. The problem was it was very heavy. If it was going to be bulletproof, it was really heavy because obviously they didn't have Kevlar and all that kind of stuff in those days. So it was steel.
Yeah, the Italians used that, I believe, but it wasn't that successful. They didn't use it all that much.
The Italians used it. The Germans used it. The British used it a little bit, but it was just too heavy to be practical. Guys couldn't wear it for long, and if they had to move at all, they just couldn't use it. Incidentally, I guess AI was booing me because of the RAF. AI, I've got to tell you, mate, that I have watched for decades now the RAF trying to destroy the Royal Navy's Fleet Air Arm, and I'm just over it, mate. I'm really bored of it. And they're still trying to do it to this very day. And every single British air-to-air kill since at least 1948 has been by the Royal Navy Fleet Air Arm, not by the RAF. Anyway, leaving that aside, Mitch, carry on, man.
Yeah, so at this point of the war in early October, this is where you start getting a lot of German internal political machinations. This is where, Prince Max von Baden, he is called up because he's seen as like the best guy in town who, on one hand, he's a monarchist, but also liberally minded. So he was seen as potentially acceptable by lots of Woodrow Wilson because at this chapter of the war, the Germans knew for a while that they weren't going to expect a lenient deal from either Clemenceau or David Lloyd George. So they thought, go cap in hand to the Americans in the hope at least of prizing apart the Entente. But it doesn't work that way. Woodrow Wilson gets, he knows what the German, because it's worth noting that for Prince Max von Baden to have become a chancellor to begin with, the likes of Ludendorff and Hindenburg had to let loose their grip on power. And Woodrow Wilson is mindful of that, so he doesn't, try to seek a separate peace or try to undercut the likes of ourselves and the French in terms of pursuing this peace deal. And this is where, for example, you have a 14 points being issued, which, I'm not a bit, I don't know what the Americans here think, but I don't want David Lloyd George because he was too accepting of all these 14 points stuff that Woodrow Wilson did. And obviously Wilson intervention.
Mitch, can I interrupt you for 1 second just to answer Key Buckley? Key Buckley says, was King George still general of the German army in October 1918? No, of course he was not. Any more than the German Kaiser was an admiral in the Royal Navy, which he had been prior to the war. But we'll talk about some naval stuff at the end of the stream, towards the end of the stream. I'm sorry, Mitch, I don't mean to keep interrupting you.
Yeah, because you do have some members of German royal families and imperial family, for Hohenzollern, who are commanding troops. But yeah, it's a matter of you have, for example, Crown Prince Ruprecht, who, he sees the woods for the trees on this one. At this chapter of the war, he knows, well, look, it's over. And you have Prince Max von Baden, who and then I believe October 15th or 16th, around that time, Ludendorff. One thing Ludendorff does in order to shore up his own political position was he would often say to the Kaiser, I'm going to resign, thereby calling his bluff. And previously, the Kaiser would beg him to remain, and Ludendorff would have complete leverage over what he does to prevent the Kaiser from interfering. But at that point, after one point where Wilson sent a few notes to the Germans saying, this is what any peace deal from your side has to look like, Ludendorff undercut Prince Max von Baden at one point. And it was at this point, Prince Max von Baden, he made the decision Ludendorff had to go. So he told the Kaiser, in as much he told him, look, Ludendorff has to go. So when Ludendorff goes and calls the Kaiser's bluff in mid-October, Ludendorff is taken aback when the Kaiser actually accepts his resignation. And it's worth noting that when the news was announced to the troops on the ground, as well as to the German public through cinemas in Berlin, everyone was cheering. You had some guys like the chiefs of staff of the army groups who were not too funny because even though they disliked Ludendorff, they were thinking, well, he was the one guy who was keeping everything in order in terms of professionalism and so on within the German high command. But I said, Ludendorff was the architect of his own demise. So, as far as I'm concerned,
very much so, Mitch. And also, as you pointed out, he was a bit of I'm trying to think what you would call him. He was a bit of a manic depressive, I think, Ludendorff in some ways. Like his mood, as you said yourself earlier, his mood would swing violently. I think also wasn't one of his sons killed in the Kaiser battle in the Kaiserslacht? Which deeply affected him, as it would, as a father, of course.
I know he had a son who died in the Worst First War. I don't know if that was certain, but I know he had a son. And
I think it was during the Kaiserslacht, I believe. I'm not absolutely certain, but I think so. And of course, that's going to affect any father. It just is. But but people need to understand that Hindenburg was the figurehead, and Ludendorff was the brains, basically.
Yeah, because at this point, I mean, Hindenburg, there was some moments where he would get out of his chair and start telling the chiefs of staff of the army groups what's what. But ultimately, it was Ludendorff who was a de facto guy commanding the German forces. After Ludendorff,
but it was the German military, and particularly Ludendorff and the German general staff. It was the German general staff who told the Kaiser he would have to resign and abdicate.
Yeah, it was Prince Max von Baden who was this was like, yeah, you're talking early November time if I'm, but yeah, was it? I think it was like late October when I think, because at this point you have because Kaiser Wilhelm was told at Spa, Spa being like this town in eastern Belgium where the OHL or German High Command they all meet up, because it's of course, as told by the name, it's a Spa town, so it's where kind of place where you can go to relax. Kaiser Wilhelm was told in no uncertain terms in late October by Ludendorff's successor, Wilhelm Groener. He was not predicted to take over. He was in charge of the German forces in Ukraine. But the thing was, he was an organizational logistics guy, so he knew better than Ludendorff how bad the German position was. For example, the Germans at this point in the 100 Days Offensive had 1.5 million horses. We on the Entente side, however, had 4.5 million horses. So when we're pulling our artillery, we have far more horses to do it with. Whereas the Germans, their horses are doing it on less quality fodder compared to our horses.
Also worth pointing out, Mitch, because it's often forgotten, that in 1918 there were cavalry charges. But as warfare became more mobile, which it did towards the end of World War One, once again you had cavalry charges, and of course the Germans and the Russians extensively used cavalry in World War Two.
Yeah, I know. Like, I think it was I heard it described as the cavalry would often act as like short-range paratroopers. You know, they'd speed along to the front lines. They would, let's say, exploit a breakthrough, remember dismount, dig in, and hold a position until the main infantry line would converge.
Yeah, absolutely, and they could do that because in the British Army, the cavalry were trained to the same standard as shooting as the infantry were. But also there were mounted charges with sabre and lance in 1980.
Yeah, and it's I'll just do a develop. So yeah, Wilhelm Groener, because I forget because but Ludendorff, he had another guy in mind to succeed him as chief as pretty much the quartermaster general. But Hindenburg was retained, however, because the Kaiser refused to let him resign. This would begin the sort of feud in later years between Hindenburg and Ludendorff, but the point where Ludendorff actually joins the National Socialist Party under Mustache Man in the 1920s. Yeah, so you have Wilhelm Groener. He tells the Kaiser in alternative terms in late October, early November, look, the army, they're ready to they just want to go home. And that's how bad the situation is, and they won't fight for the Kaiser. So when you have, for example, on November 4th, the Kiel Mutiny, which is where the High Seas Fleet, all the sailors are told, you're going to go against the British fleet. Predictably, they'll all mutiny because they know it was a suicide mission. They're not going to stick their heads above a parapet for someone like that. So this is where the German Revolution starts. So in the last 7 days of war, you already have the German army on the retreat. So, for example, as I said, you have the Germans, for example, abandoning areas like Lille in northern France. They're having to abandon the Belgian coastline. They're having to abandon a lot of ground. The Americans are also attacking. It's worth noting that even while the Americans were fresh troops, they were really green. So in McMurray's Argonne offensive, for example, George S. Patton gets wounded commanding his 1st Provisional Tank Brigade up like a steep hill, which is densely held defensive position. but he was livid at how a lot of American officers and soldiers were floundering at the bitter realization of how bad trench warfare would be for them. Because at this time, John J. Pershing, for example, he believed that the frontier spirit of the Americans would mean without having necessary aggression to break the deadlock. But it wasn't as easy cut as that. I mean,
not at all. Look, to be fair, two of the American divisions, the U.S. Marine Corps Division and the 1st Division, who were their pre-war regular troops, did fight very well. They were very brave men, and they were pretty well trained because they were pre-war regular soldiers. But there was a case in 1918 where a British soldier watching an American attack said, "Look at those silly bastards running into the barrage." You know, by this stage, like British, Australians and Canadians who'd been flying for years, and also New Zealanders and South Africans, who'd been flying on the Western Front for years, they didn't do silly shit like that anymore. They'd had enough of it, you know?
Yeah, I mean, that's only one thing you get from the Americans away, but also like they're massively green. They're having to learn everything very quickly. And yeah, I think like Pershing had to remove some of his own generals because a lot of them just floundered in the face of the Meuse-Argonne offensive, for example.
Unsurprising when the American army was tiny, even compared to the British army before the war. So, you know, also I'd say, guys, if you can, what's his name? You can watch the Martin Made podcast, and his first episode which is basically going to be about the Germans in World War II, was mostly about World War One. And in particular, he quotes a lot of, what's his name, Mitch?
Sorry, him?
He quotes a lot of the German officer guy. I can't remember his name. I'm always recommending his book because I know he is. Junger. Thank you very much, Lothar.
It's
Ernst Junger. Ernst Junger. He quotes Ernst Junger quite frequently in this podcast, which I recommend, by the way. The podcast is good. But Ernst Junger's book is called Storm of Steel, and it's really good. And one of the things you'll like about it, if you read it and you're a British person like myself and Mitch, is that he's very complimentary about the British. Like, he doesn't slag the British off at all. He thinks the British were good, brave soldiers, and he's much less complimentary about the French, for example. But anyway,
yeah, it's like I think like at this point, I know that the French army, for example, they just weren't capable of doing anything by themselves at this point. If they were to do any offensive action, they'd have to do it in conjunction with either us or the Americans, because
and they had to do quite small attacks because, as I said, the French had this enormous mutiny in 1917 and had to be handled very, very carefully.
Yeah, that was handled by Philippe Pétain. And Pétain, because that's the thing, Pétain could have been if Foch refused to become Allied Supreme Commander, it would have been Philippe Pétain, because Pétain was quite a bit of a what you call a noble fatalist. You know, if you give him some bad news, he'll react to it the same way as he would react to the good news. Very calm under pressure, but also when he dealt with it, I know that Pétain, he had a hard time dealing with the Americans, because the Americans would often talk about how they're going to go on the attack. Whereas Pétain, he's looking at this going, okay, he's thinking, he's heard this all from guys like Nivelle and Joffre and all these other
the French had lost an awful lot of men by this stage. They really had. I mean, they lost a lot more men than the British and old Commonwealth guys did, because they had a bigger army. And the French had just lost so many men. And I think you can argue that even by 1940, French morale had not really recovered from World War One.
Yeah, the main problem the French had was their birth rate stagnated since Napoleon, because Napoleon got so many Frenchmen killed. But the birth rate just stagnated in the 19th century, in the lead up to the First World War. So
100%.
When the French lose 1 million men in this war, literally just because the French have a spirit of constant attack all the damn time for 3 years, and all they do is they just bash my head against a literal wall in the form of German defences, like the defensive depth system.
And the French trenches were shit, Mitch. The British noted when the British army got bigger and it started taking over French trenches, they would notice that the French trenches were crap. They were shallow. They weren't well drained. There weren't enough dugouts because the French, because they believed in this offensive bollocks, always considered, oh no, we're not going to be here long, so we're not going to improve our trench, make it safer for our soldiers.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, and in fact, the main things that were keeping France in the war at this point were Georges Clemenceau, who would often visit the front line and shout insults at the Germans, even to a point where Ludendorff often lamented that he wished the civilian government in Germany had that same courage. But also, I remember there was Philippe Pétain, who was very good at calming down the mutinies, but he had to, at this point of the war, the French just couldn't do anything by themselves anymore. But if they were to do offensive activity, they'd be largely covering the flank of the Australians and the Canadians, or they'd be working with the Americans. In the case of the Meuse-Argonne offensive, Americans were now of a lost battalion. They got cut off because the French, who were meant to be covering their flanks, got chucked back. And of a case of, I remember watching a good film about this, but this was like 15.
The Lost Battalion is quite a good film. Yes, I've seen it. I think it's based on a book, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I remember watching that a lot when I was like 10 or 11, and
but there's a newer version, Mitch. There's a version from, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago. Oh, actually, I suppose you would have watched that when you were 10, 15 years ago. Sorry, mate. I forget how much older than you I am.
No, it was the film I was watching. I was like, oh bloody hell! It was like early 2000s, or late 90s, I believe. This version of The Lost Battalion was released. It was, the camera work looks like around early 2000s, if I had to guess.
Another good one is Paths of Glory, which is an American film, but it's set in the French army, and it's what leads up. It's what leads up to the mutinies and all the rest of it in the French army. And yeah, Paths of Glory is a pretty good film. Kirk Douglas, I think, stars, and as you rightly say, Kubrick, I think, made that.
Yeah, I think it was one of his first films, if I remember. I always forget Kubrick started it. He's a lot older than he actually was, because 1950s he started. Because I mean, it's such a big film for a guy who was relatively new to directing at the time. But anyway, yeah.
I've heard some nasty rumors about Kirk Douglas and Natalie Wood, but I'm not going to go into them on this stream. But anyway.
Yeah, that's probably the best way to sum up the French of a chapter of the war, was they're purely just supportive rather than being mean.
In 1918, very much they had to take a supporting role because the French army wasn't prepared to do big, large-scale attacks. And if they were going to lose a lot of casualties, they wouldn't go forward.
Yeah, and certainly, I mean, after the Hindenburg Line was broken, so in early October, the Germans are just they then decide bitterly, it's rather a matter of too little too late, that they should have withdrawn back to this Antwerp-Meuse line. But I said, we're chasing behind them. Granted, in a lot of cases, not fast enough, but the fact of the matter remains, the German army, they were broken. There was no way they were going to resist. We could push all the way to the Rhine. And in fact, I think it was Churchill and other people, mainly Churchill from what I remember, who favoured continuing the war until January, because they wanted to push into German soil, so then that way the defeat would be complete. Because and to Churchill's credit, he did predict that the Germans would try and cope about this by going, oh, well, we didn't lose the war, we were stabbed in the back by the civilian government, because technically all the fighting was all done in France and Belgium. But
I think we have to address this a little bit. Obviously, in the 1930s, when the mid-century Germans became a thing, the stab in the back became an enormous myth. The German army never lost, really. They were stabbed in the back by the civilians, in particular certain groups of civilians, and all the rest of it. And I'm sure there was some truth in some of that, but a lot of it was the German Navy, to be fair. The Germans had created the second largest navy in the world, made Britain an enemy by doing so, and it was obvious that was going to make Britain an enemy, because the British Empire absolutely depended on the Royal Navy. And if you were going to challenge that, you were going to become an enemy of Britain. The Germans had no need to do that whatsoever. They could have fought France and Russia without having an enormous navy. And they could have had a navy big enough to beat the French, and the Royal Navy wouldn't have given a shit, basically, because it wouldn't have come near to challenging the Royal Navy. And as far as I'm concerned, the Kaiser and his political advisors deliberately made Britain an enemy of Germany in the early 1900s. And they did so needlessly. The German Navy came out on a number of occasions, but only once really in full strength, when they were surprised by the British Grand Fleet and had to run away twice. Like, we not just turn around and try and get back to German ports, but actually reverse the order of all their battleships, because they were going to be destroyed by the vastly superior British fleet, which had won the dreadnought race decisively by about 1911. And the Germans in 1912 admitted as much. But it was too late by then. And the German Navy basically did nothing useful in World War One, nothing useful whatsoever. It brought the Americans into the war with its unrestricted submarine campaign. But the German Navy did nothing useful at all in World War One. And then at the end of World War One, the German naval officers, because they were honorable men, decided they were going to do a suicide charge against the Grand Fleet. And the Royal Navy Grand Fleet was even more powerful in 1918 than it had been in 1916, when they had to run away from it. So it was a suicide mission. And the sailors, of course, knew the signs of ships that were getting up steam and all the rest of it, and loading ammunition and what have you. And the sailors all mutinied. And all put communist armbands on, and all, not all, but a huge number of them put communist armbands on and took over naval ports and arrested some of their own officers, etc., etc. And it was that, if there was a stab in the back, it was that really finished Germany off totally. And it was the Navy, which was always a luxury fleet for the Germans. The Germans never needed a big fleet. It was a luxury fleet, and it did them no good whatsoever. If joining World War One in 1914 and then raising a mass army against all British military tradition was the original sin of the British Empire, which I think it was, then building a giant high seas fleet for the Germans was the original sin for the Germans.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah, and it's the biggest case of a strategic white elephant, I think, in history. Yeah, because we probably wouldn't.
It did nothing. It sat around in harbour for almost all of the First World War, and the few occasions it came out, it got beaten by the Royal Navy and had to run away.
Just to say, so I mean, because there's comments going about treaty for being the Germans justified in anger. I mean, the Germans. I mean, look what they did to the Russians in Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. I mean, you could argue that the Russians had to deal with famine as a result of being deprived of food from Ukraine. Because the thing was, the Germans took over basically Eastern Europe, like Ukraine, Belarus, Baltic states. They also sent troops to help the Finnish with their civil war against their Bolshevik elements. And the thing was, after that, whatever chance Germany had of potentially having sort of a compromised peace with the West, with the likes of ourselves, the Americans and the French, died out. because how can the likes of Ludendorff and Hindenburg say to the West, "Oh, can you please take pity with us because we just carved up the Russian Empire?" And it's one of the things where you go. Secondly,
100, Mitch. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, I think it was a completely ruthless treaty, which was far worse than anything Versailles did.
Yeah, it's as Aaron Huck will say in previous streams. The thing was, the reparations the Germans had to deal with, they were payable. Like they could have paid them, but the Germans, I mean, Ludendorff, for example, in 1919, he had this meeting with his British Army officer. Ludendorff was ranting about how it was the Social Democrats and even the Jews and all this. And this British Army officer, who he's entertaining his guest, is going, "So you mean to tell me, sir, that you were stabbed in the back?" And it's from this point that Ludendorff he zeroes in on that phrase, and he disseminates it all over the place. Basically, Ludendorff was a massive sore loser. He just couldn't accept that he lost the war through his own strategic mistakes in the war. Like Germans had lost the war militarily.
100%, Mitch. 100%. Can I just answer Dissident Knight in the chat? He says, Duke, can you describe the Navy's tactics for routing the U-boats, please? Well, routing is the wrong word in World War One, but I can actually very simply describe it. The Royal Navy eventually introduced convoys, and as soon as they did so, the U-boats didn't get anywhere near enough kills to affect the war. As soon as the Royal Navy brought in convoys, and of course in World War II, the Royal Navy introduced convoys straight away, because if you got a convoy, it makes the German U-boats attack you where you have defending surface ships. And as soon as the Royal Navy introduced convoys in World War One, the British losses dropped off like a cliff.
Yeah, because the U-boats were hunting as lone wolves. Because you have a wolf packs in World War II, but in the First World War, it's a lone wolf. And dealing with convoys, you can't do that as much when you got to deal with convoys, like destroyers and so on. Yeah, so and what was I saying? Yeah, it's like I don't know. Let's say the communists, right? I mean, it's like okay. So, for example, Bulgaria. I mean, I think Bulgaria has more of an argument to say that they lost the war more of internal problems rather than military defeat. Because for Bulgarians, they were still in a position where they were fighting the Salonika front, which was one hell of a front to fight. Like it was just really awkward to mount an offensive in that area, and the Bulgarians were more undone by socialist unrest, because you have the soldiers set up around Soviets. But yeah, I would say on one you have a blockade, which was starving Germany. I mean, things like the average German diet at this point was 1,000 calories. In Austria-Hungary, meanwhile, it was 830. Then you factor in as well, you got Germany's allies. They quit one by one, the Ottomans, the Bulgarians, and Austro-Hungarians. If the Germans prolonged the war, you would have had the Italians storming through into Bavaria for Austria, for a start. Secondly, the Germans in Belgium, I mean, they were just giving up land. They had no defensive line to anchor themselves on. The Antwerp-Meuse line, which they should have done before August 8th, before the August offensive. By the time they saw the logic of that, it was too little too late. The German army was fizzing out. There were brawls between Bavarians and Prussians where these towns in northern France and Belgium were just getting plundered. Land was just being given up, largely without a fight a lot of the time, because, as I said, the German army just fizzled out. The German army, they just didn't want to fight anymore. They just wanted to get on. They didn't care who won the war. They just wanted out of it at this point. And given that the Hindenburg line was the last linchpin by which the Germans could try to salvage some sort of compromise peace, but without being broken, that's it. The spine of the German army was broken, and that was it. You factor that also in with basically the Germans being tactically and operationally and strategically outfought by the British Empire, especially in northern France and Belgium. I mean, how could Germany actually win in November 1918? It was not possible. If they stretch it out for a few
think,
months.
Mitch, I think it's also worth pointing out that the British Army in in the First World War in 1914-18, I've got to say, as someone who has been interested in military history all my life, the British Army in the First World War was a lot tougher than the British Army in World War II. And
Yeah.
I don't mean to say this to be in any way insulting to World War II veterans. I really don't. I've known many World War II veterans, including relatives. But the British Army in World War One was a lot tougher. Look at the number of British Army prisoners in World War One compared to World War Two, and you will find it's vastly smaller.
Yeah, I mean,
British soldiers did not tend to surrender in World War One.
Yeah,
they just didn't.
Yeah, in Kaiserslacht, entire regiments were slaughtered because they just didn't surrender. Like they fought to the last man against the German onslaught.
Absolutely, Mitch. They would just hold out till there were half a dozen of them left, and they had no ammunition. You know.
Yeah. Oh, another thing is
that was a tough army. That was a very tough army that Britain had in World War One.
Yeah. Yeah, it's we're going like the armistice in this famous train carriage of Compiègne. You have Matthias Erzberger. Now he's handed basically a shit sandwich from a military command, who basically said to him, "Look, we can't win the war, but you know, we try to seek the best terms as possible." And Ferdinand Foch, standing here, he at first Matthias Erzberger says, "Oh, we are open to accepting terms for a cessation of hostilities on land, sea, and air." Ferdinand Foch, he didn't like the wording of that, so he gets to openly request an armistice. So then that way, because Foch, he's cognizant of, okay, the German side, they might try to pin blame upon the Western Allies for any sort of harsh peace treaty, which ends up manifesting, well, harsh by the eyes of the Germans, but I don't see the armistice in Versailles being that harsh in the grand scheme of things. But anyway, so Foch, you got to factor as well, the French were vengeful. Like Clemenceau being ruthless. I mean, wouldn't you be? Imagine fighting on your own land for 4 years, fighting on some of your best land.
Also, Mitch, very important to remember that Prussia and the German Empire had crushed France in 1870 and taken Alsace and Lorraine and all the rest of it. And so the French were absolutely out to get revenge for that shit, you know?
Yeah, and the French being vengeful. I mean, yeah. For example, you know, the armistice says the Germans have to give up like 5,000 trains, 150,000 train carriages, as well as give up Alsace-Lorraine. They have to withdraw all their troops to the Rhine. They have to you could say it's a total. The German side of things, they would see it as a total capitulation, but you got to factor they had no leverage at this point. Really, they could fight and carry on fighting, but as I said, you've got on one hand, you got revolution at home, you've got the Italians who are going to rampage into Bavaria through Austria. Germany is all by themselves. Their military, like the last linchpin they had was the Hindenburg Line. That was broken. Ludendorff was a main guy who, you could say, he kept the OHL in working order, but after he was gone, OHL was started becoming a lot more of a dysfunctional mess. Discipline and professionalism went out the window. It was just a matter of, there was no victory to be had for the Germans.
I totally agree, Mitch. Just to answer AI in the chat here with the comment I put up on the screen. AI, I invited you and about 4 or 5 other people to join this stream. If you guys don't join, then I'm sorry. I don't know what else I can do. I mean, I do see what you're saying. There was a Bolshevik breakaway state in Bavaria, and the Free Corps recaptured it, and had an influence on Moustache Man. Yeah, all of that's true, mate. But honestly, I invite loads of people to join these history streams, and if people don't join, that's not my fault. I can't twist people's arm and make them do so. So I'm sorry, Mitch. I'm interrupting you again. I beg your pardon.
Yeah. So, because it's funny how, like, so in school, for example, the left-wing interpretation of this chapter of history is, well, the Germans were unfairly treated, that they were treated too harshly, and that such and such. I'm looking at this going, like, after stuff like Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, the breaking of the Hindenburg Line, as well as stuff like, for example, Ludendorff at times undercutting the civilian government. It's just a matter of, and also French desire for revenge, because why wouldn't you as a Frenchman? You're thinking to yourself, you want to reduce the Germans so that they can't get a moment's peace. Because the whole point of 100 Days Offensive was you don't give the Germans any respite. You're always on the attack, or whether it be in this sector in the north or one sector in the south, you're always on the attack. And even amidst this
Mitch,
negotiation,
and you move your attacks, Mitch, so that as the Germans try to move their reserves in one direction, you attack somewhere else, and of course their reserves aren't there; they're in the other place. So, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So this is why, for example, Ferdinand Foch, for example, is often seen as being harsh towards the Germans. Well, as I said, he
I'm not a frog, obviously, any more than you are. But yes, I see what you're saying.
Yeah, but like Foch, for example, he lost a son. He also lost a son-in-law in the war. Like, his son was, for example, killed in the first month of the war, and he lost his son-in-law, I believe, at Verdun. So he's got personal tragedies from the war, and you also got the fact, as I said, the French want revenge. That's why Clemenceau is in charge. You've got also, like, we Brits also are wanting some modicum of revenge, but not as harsh as what the French want. Whereas you have Woodrow Wilson, he's not wanting revenge, really. But, what leverage did he have against us? We fought in the war for long.
But Woodrow Wilson, to be honest, introduced the subversive idea of self-determination and all this bollocks, which broke up the Austro-Hungarian Empire, for example, which I think was a bad thing. I would have left Austria-Hungary intact if I'd have been the Western Allies. I think breaking it up into all those poxy little states was a bad idea.
Yeah, and but you have at this time Matthias Erzberger and the German delegation, they're given like this armistice. They're told, look, it's non-negotiable. You've got 72 hours to come to a decision with your civilian government and so on, if you want to accept this. There's no negotiating room for the Germans. They're just and
Key Buckley, you're not correct about this. I'm sorry. The 14 points was Woodrow Wilson. It had nothing to do with the British. 14 points was Woodrow Wilson and the Americans. It had fuck all to do with the British. Nothing. Because we didn't support those 14 points because we had a great big empire, in case you didn't notice. But anyway, I'm sorry, Mitch. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think of what more to say. But so you have this, I believe, so Prince Max von Baden, he ends up resigning on the 10th of November. After him comes Friedrich Ebert, who says to Matthias Erzberger at 5 o'clock in the morning, look, sign whatever deal the French put forward. Like, we need to end this war right now because we've got revolution at home and the home front is starving to death and we just need to bring it to an end right here and now. Like, there's too many of our men dying. So that's when we sign it. And this is why on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, the war comes to an end in terms of the actual fighting.
And I read today, Mitch, that supposedly the last dude who was killed in World War One was an American artillery dude who was killed 1 minute before the armistice.
Yeah, Henry Gunter.
Talk about being the most unlucky bastard in the whole wide world.
Well, the thing was, so he was a German American. He felt that he was because he got demoted because he made some serious screw up earlier on in the war. and he felt that he wanted to get that promotion, so he decided to be a lot more aggressive than he should have been. He started to charge this German MG post literally a couple of minutes before the war was over. The German guys manning the MG position, they were trying to wave him off, going, "No, don't do it, mate. Don't do it."
How
He charges anyway.
fucking insane, mate! What an idiot!
Yeah, basically, he felt that he needed to do something to restore his original rank because, as I said, he got demoted early on in the war. But yeah, he gets killed literally out of the stupidest of all reasons when you think about it.
Yeah, just insane, mate. Just really fucking stupid. But yeah, I don't know. I watched today the documentary "They Shall Not Grow Old." You know, the one by the guy who made the Lord of the Rings.
Oh, Peter Jackson, yeah.
Yeah, Peter Jackson. Really good documentary, actually, if you watch it. And like because I'm an old bastard, you know, like I'm 60. And when I was a teenager, there were still loads of First World War veterans around. And I got to know a lot of these guys, partly because I used to be in this preservation society in South London. What used to be the Surrey Docks, which by this time was closed down. We used to sell day tickets to people fishing, so we could do things like look after the birds and stop the wars with fish and all this kind of stuff. And I was supposed to go and charge these old boys like 50 pence, half a pound, for a day ticket to go fishing, and I never did because, you know, they were old chaps. But what I did used to do when I was like 13, 14, 15 is I'd sit there and listen to their war stories. And the funny thing is that these First World War guys often had great war stories. But what I will tell you is the vast majority of them were when they were in reserve positions behind the trenches, or when they were given a bit of leave and they could visit the local town and this kind of stuff. And they had great, great stories. And I always liked the fact that a lot of these old blokes, they'd go fishing in a collar and tie, you know. And like one old bloke I knew, who I used to see like a couple of times every week, he used to tell me how he hated living in a 9th-story tower block with no garden. And he couldn't sit out in a back garden like he could when he was younger and he had a home, you know, a proper house. But yeah, these people were great people. They really were. Fabulous people. That's why I always buy my red poppy, even if I don't always agree with the politics of the Royal British Legion, which I certainly don't these days, which is trying to plug all sorts of bloody black and brown people at the expense of real British Anglo-Celtic people. But yeah, I mean, you know, remigration is inevitable, as I always say, because it is. But yeah, they were great men. Very understated. I mean, like some of them were really incredibly brave. Like this guy I was talking about, who lived on the 9th floor of a tower block off Old Jamaica Road. He charged over the top on the first day of the Somme and got quite badly wounded. Got sent back to England for medical treatment. Got given a white feather because he was in civilian clothes. And the reason he was in civilian clothes was he was going to see his wife, and his wife was petrified he was going to get killed. So when he was given embarkation leave because he was going back to France, he didn't want to scare his wife, so he wore civilian clothes. And some horrible middle-class feminist bitch, you know, one of these suffragettes who were actually feminist scumbags, gave him a white feather. And like he'd been badly wounded on the Somme. And he then went back to his regiment and he fought all through the Kaiser Battle. And he fought all through the 100 Days, which is what we've just been talking about. And just a incredibly brave guy. But if you met him in the street, you just think, he was a nice little old gentleman, but incredibly brave, man.
Yeah, I would say what was I going to say? I know, like, because in my racial role, like, there was one case where this guy said he was like 16 or 17, like he wasn't old enough to be drafted, and this one woman granted him a white feather because he said to her, "Oh, I'm only 17." I was like, "Oh, that's what we all say, except the suffragette." And I'm like, "Yeah, I very people very much
Imagine some fucking woman who couldn't possibly be sent to the front because she was a woman, right? And don't get me wrong, I don't think women should be in the military, not in frontline roles anyway. But yeah, imagine being some poxy middle class feminist suffragette woman and giving poor young chaps in Britain white feathers to say you're a coward. Although I think it's quite typical of women, I've got to say. Many of them. There are good women, but
Yeah, not much to say. Yeah. But that's the thing. Yeah, so this 100 Days Offensive, it's like I would say it's a peak of the British Army. This is why I don't get why like British historiography of this war and Canadian British historiography focuses so much on the Somme and Ypres and Passchendaele, which are a lot more tragic, whereas the 100 Days Offensive feels a lot more triumphal. It's like everything just went well for us in this phase of the war, which is spoken about compared to.
I know why they do, Mitch, because it's all aimed at destroying real British Anglo-Celtic morale and linked to the past. It's all designed to do that.
Well, okay, we do it's not the same with the Charge of the Light Brigade in the Crimean War. I mean, we Brits just like to romanticize sort of futile endeavors, I suppose. That's probably the best explanation for it, because we were doing this even before all of the subversion from the last 50 years.
Sure. Yeah, you're not wrong. You're not wrong.
But it's like, and you have a British Army in late 1918, which is probably the best British Army of all time thus far. Anyway, and it's certainly one where you go, you do look at the British Army into war period and you go, what the hell happened that we just forgotten all these lessons? Even someone, for example, JFC Fuller wrote his book in the mid 1920s, I believe, about he basically predicted Blitzkrieg. And had we listened to him, we wouldn't have been surprised by the Germans invading France in 1940, perhaps. But
possibly true. Yeah. Yep. I think that 30 Wacko 11 makes a good point here.
Yeah, I blame Blackadder so much for that. I hate that narrative, because it's like, well, they're going, the toffs, like the aristocrats, led all the poor working class lads to their deaths. I'm like, well, the aristocrats, I think like a quarter of all aristocrats who served in the First World War were killed.
Absolutely. Officers' casualty rates were vastly higher, and even sergeants were vastly more likely to be killed than privates. But officer casualty rates, because they were expected to lead their men from the front, they were enormous. The bloody toffs died in probably more than equal numbers, proportionately low for Sheffield.
Yeah,
in fact, that was probably the real end of the British aristocracy in many respects.
Yeah, it's like I was reading about Douglas Haig in terms of, because Douglas Haig, he was a lot more of a conservative, traditional kind of army school, whereas you have David Lloyd George, who of course been a lot more of a liberal and a very sort of left wing one of that, just hated that side of British society. Like that's why Haig and Lloyd George just didn't get on all that much.
Also worth pointing out, Mitch, that Lloyd George and Winston Churchill Winston Churchill, of course, left the Conservative Party way prior to World War One, and was great mates with Lloyd George, because Winston Churchill wasn't really a conservative, and he never was. He was an asshole.
Yeah, and it's. I'm not a big fan of David Lloyd George for a whole lot of reasons. One of those being that basically tried a lot to destroy the old England, but yeah, and I must have been like, I don't know too much about Haig in the grand scheme of things, but if I'm looking at this, I'm going, yeah, he is unfairly judged in hindsight. Going, oh well, why didn't you do this and the other? And so, well, it's great to say this in hindsight, but the fact is, a lot of lessons that had to be learned. Yeah, had to be learned the hard way, basically. Like, for example, Passchendaele, yeah, one of the most horrible battles of the entire First World. I would not want to serve in that battle. But like, the fact is, it did teach lessons of trying to think. Is that the first battle, like the Battle of the Somme as well? Like, Haig in 1918, he probably is probably the best, one of the best commanders of the war in 1918. The fact that he listens to guys like Rawlinson and Cook, because there was one point where so at that push of Amiens that I was mentioning earlier, Foch was wanting Haig to push on further. But then Rawlinson just told him, look, who's commanding the British Army here? Is it you or Foch? And at that point, Hoche listened to Rawlinson and decided, okay, he's not going to push his men further than they've already done so far.
Mitch, I'm not a big fan of Rawlinson, who was a complete Francophile, but yeah, all right. I think Aaron Hook is right what he says in the chat, that oh, what a lovely war is the source of it, and Blackadder just regurgitated it. Yeah, a lot of truth in that, Aaron. A lot of truth in that.
I can believe that.
I like this quote from 30 Wacko 11. Churchill would use the skin of his mother to bang his own drum. Yeah, I can believe that. I am no fan of Churchill at all. I really think he was disastrous for Britain and the Empire.
Yeah, I will say that it was rather prescient of him, like, as I mentioned earlier, he wanted to prolong the war by a few more months to get the war to go into Germany itself, because granted, I think, like, because Churchill did predict that the German, especially guys at Ludendorff, they would try to pin it on the civilian government, and that they would just try and cope about it that way. And he wasn't wrong about it. But
on the other hand, would it have been worth losing another 30 or 50,000 British and old Commonwealth soldiers? I didn't think so, to be honest with you.
You could say it would.
Listen, this is changing the subject slightly, Mitch, but I know you've looked at this the same as I have. Britain did not have to give a war guarantee to Poland in 1939. There was no reason Britain had to go to war in 1939. It was entirely the choice of the British government to do so. So on that basis, then no, I don't think it was worth losing another 30 or 50,000 British, Australian, Canadian, New Zealand, and South African soldiers in 1918 or 1919.
Yeah, because it's I believe around late October time, like Churchill, he was the Secretary of State for munitions, I believe. Well, not the munitions, of trying to think of something else. It certainly was I think it was in the cabinet, or certainly what high above that kind. He was saying also that because of the casualties and because of the fact that we were running dry of men in late 1918, if we were to carry on the war into 1919, we would have had to depend far more on artillery and tanks and more mechanized side of things, because the manpower was starting to really run out.
Someone's saying about Churchill tanks, that was in World War II, Watkins, plus, and no, not particularly. They actually, one of the good things about the Churchill tank is it had very thick armor, and it could also climb very steep hills that most tanks couldn't get up. So no, it wasn't a bad tank. It was also the basis of most of the so-called funnies that the British used in 44 and 45. But yeah, anyway, different subject. Did you have any final points you wanted to make, Mitch?
Would pit cinema all quite on a Western front? I mean, because I think he's on about the whole lines
The
like
movie.
I would say the 1979 version is the best. From what I don't know about the 1930 version. I haven't
It's
watched
all
that.
right. It's all right. Just don't watch the most recent one. The most recent one is absolute shit and terrible.
Yeah, I can't get much into it because they said, like, you know, they say, like, oh, Paul Bäumer and his mates joined in 1917, but by that point, the German home front is starving. The enthusiasm that you would have had in 1914 had long since dissipated. So it seems anticlimactic to have the film set in it from 1917 when they join, whereas no, it should be 1914 as per the book.
Yeah, absolutely agree with you, mate. And yeah, the 70s one's not terrible, but the last one is really shit. The most recent one is crap.
Yeah, and
historically, it's crap.
I will say I do like the scenes regarding the armistice, like when they're like discussing it over, because basically, yeah, it's like, you know, Matthias Erzberger, played by Daniel Brühl, he's saying it perfectly best. He's saying, well, look, every month 250,000 Americans are landing in. You know, the home front is starving. We can't. Our troops are fleeing the field. Like they're not capable anymore of the same vigor they were a few years before. That's the only good thing really I will say about the film is the fact that the armistice scenes, which aren't included in other versions, I will say are worth watching. But yeah, in terms of other stuff about that 2022 film version, yeah,
It's terrible. I watched it and I struggled to watch it to the end because there's just so much crap in it, basically. But yeah.
I'm trying to think of other things. I can't think of anything. No, I think I've said everything. There, yeah.
Well, guys, yeah. I thank you to Mitch because he knows far more about this subject than I do, as he has demonstrated during this stream. We will be back on Saturday, British time, with our normal current affairs, politics, and news stream, I guess you could say, from a British and Old Commonwealth point of view, which is by no means the most common one on the internet. But yeah, I think next week, Mitch, will probably do part 2 of Anglo-Celtic resistance, Anglo-Saxon resistance to the Normans. If that's what you want to do, anyway.
Yeah, I don't know if AI will be available, but I'll be available for that. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I hope AI will come on for that because he was on the first one. But yeah, at the moment, the plan is the next week's history stream will be part 2 of our Anglo-Saxon resistance to the Normans after 1066. But we'll be back on Saturday for our normal current affairs and politics and news stream. And we have a fair amount to talk about, I guess. I'm going to play us out with what I hope will be an appropriate tune if it works. Let's see if it does.
Somewhere in France today, he's been doing his bit up to his eyes in play each night. pass the time along. He's got a little gramophone that plays his song. Take me back to dear old Blighty. Put me on the train for London town. Take me over there, drop me anywhere. Birmingham, Leeds or Manchester, well I don't care. I should love to see my best girl cuddling up again with soon to be. Diddly-diddly-I-dee, hurry me back to Blighty. Blighty is the place for me. One day, Mickey O'Shea out in a trench somewhere, so brave, having a shave, trying to part his hair. Mickey yells, dodging the shells and lumps of dynamite. Talk of the Crystal Palace on a fireworks night. Take me back to dear old Blighty. Put me on the train for London town. Take me over there, drop me anywhere. Birmingham, Leeds or Manchester, well I don't care. I should love to see my best girl cuddling up again with soon to be. Diddly-diddly-I-dee, hurry me back to Blighty. Blighty is the place for me.
And that was, of course, from Patriotic Archive. Please go and check out his channel if you like good traditional naval and military and also folk music. Yeah, I don't know. Sad subject. I noticed that apparently the Special Air Service, the SAS, is conducting its biggest ever operation this year to protect Armistice Day ceremonies that goes back to the First World War. And as far as I'm concerned, that just proves how mass third-world immigration is a total mistake and a total evil, and that mass remigration is an absolute essential, and it's going to happen. I think it's inevitable. Thank you very much to my guest, Mitch. Go well, guys, and don't let the bastards grind you down.